Hi, I'm Edie Stern, and we're about to interview Lee and Barry Gold. It is Thursday, the first day of Worldcon 76, and we are here in San Jose. So Lee and Barry, thank you so much for sitting down with me. And my first question is, what got you started in science fiction fandom?
So which of us are you asking?
You guys are married,
people.
you figure it out. Somebody answer.
Okay. I was going to Caltech in 1964, and I happened to be in Lloyd House, which is one of the, at that time, seven student houses at Caltech, and possibly one of the strangest. And as it happened, Lloyd House had a connection sort of with fandom.
You were reading science fiction already.
Well, I was already reading science fiction. I've been reading science fiction since I was about 11 or earlier.
Take a deep breath and explain that you got in as the youngest.
That's irrelevant.
Isn't.
Okay. So
you were 16.
Huh? Yeah.
Prodigies. Please
Okay.
continue.
So earlier, about 2 years before I came, a guy named, I can't remember his real name, Fred Langley. Fred Langley had gotten involved in LASFS. He was going to Lloyd House. And he adopted the name Steve Tolliver because the initials are ST, which corresponds to the character of the saint in the novels. So he was Steve Tolliver, Fred Langley. He was also involved in the time that they stole the Rose Bowl card stunts.
I think I've heard of that.
We'll tell you later.
Yes, and so he'd gotten involved with fandom, and he'd gotten B. Joe Trimble to draw something or other to help decorate the house for something.
So you were one step removed from fandom, all right then.
Right. So came time for the inter-house dance. Each house decorates themselves up on some theme, and people from all over the campus and friends and family all come to visit and dance and talk and things like that. And so Lloyd House decided to do a science fiction theme thing, and one of our seniors still remembered Bijo and got her to come out for the price of a steak dinner for Bijo and John. And steak dinners were not that expensive at Caltech because they weren't very good steaks.
Irrelevant.
Yes.
Keep going.
And
while she was
while she was basically, she took long pieces of butcher paper, okay, and she started drawing on them with a Marxalog, okay, and then it fell to us to fill them in with watercolor, tempera, I guess actually. So she drew, we painted, and we got all this stuff hung up in alien planet scenes all over the main room of the house.
And while she was doing
that, she was talking about science fiction fandom and about things that happened at science fiction fandom, like Isaac Asimov being in an elevator with some young femme fan who was, totally swooning over him, and him making some particularly humorous crack. Also, and it just sounded like this is something I've got to be part of.
And how old were you?
I was 17 at that point.
It sounds like a good age to get involved in fandom.
Right.
Now it's my turn.
Yes.
Well, let's see. In 1966 or 67, I strolled into the UCLA student store, and there were 3 other people there who were freshmen. I wasn't. I was a teaching assistant, which means I was older. I was in my second year of grad school. And we stood there in front of the science fiction section and discussed which books were worth buying, until people came to us and said, "It's 10 p.m., get out." And we said, we can't count on running into each other. Let's start a club that meets every month and talk about science fiction books. And we did, every month, at my apartment, because they were kids and lived with their parents. And we called ourselves the Third Foundation.
Great name.
We thought so. We said we had been founded at the end of eternity to make sure that Harry Seldon was born on time. And LASFS we put cards up on bulletin boards saying, if you want to talk about science fiction, this is where we meet, this is when the next meeting will be. Each month we elect a new member who will decide what book we're discussing next month. And LASFS sent an emissary to us. And we said, well, we've heard about LASFS. You're people who don't read science fiction anymore. You just talk about fandom and conventions, but you don't read science fiction books anymore. We're not going to you. We sit here and talk about science fiction books. Occasionally science fiction movies, which aren't very good in the late 1960s, thank you. Occasionally science fiction television, which is even worse in the late 1960s. But we read this stuff, and you don't. We know all about you. And they looked at us in horror and went away. And then in July of 1967, we went to Worldcon. We wore little badges that said the Third Foundation. We put a sign on a table that said reserved, Third Foundation.
Oh, well done.
We were horrible people. We were having so much fun. We went to a dealer and straightened out his books for them so they were in alphabetical order. And he gave me a couple of free books in exchange. Steve Golden and I, Steve later became a pro. Steve Golden and I were wearing little gold tendrils in our hair like slants, and someone grabbed us and took us over and introduced us to A. Van Vogt, which was nice. And then, after that, we went to LASFS with our first fanzine, called, of course, the Third Foundation, issue number 77, with answers to last issue's quiz, letters of comments on last issue. How did you ever get that story from Robert Heinlein? There had been no previous issues. And
troublemakers from the beginning.
Well, we were a little odd. So, and folk songs, which I had written. And one of my first memories of that first LASFS meeting is this strange young man who at this point was 20, sitting there at midnight singing one of my folk songs. You, sing.
Remind me.
Oh, what a...
Oh, what a beautiful Martian. Oh, what a lovely E.T. I've got an uneasy feeling she's got a big crush on me.
Cut. So, this is how Barry and I met. I was 24, he was 20, which is a big, 4 years is a big difference at that point. Later on, after 50 years, it's not quite as big a difference anymore.
So when you started with writing filk songs, had you heard filk songs before? Were you introduced to? So
I had read song parodies, of course. They were in Mad Magazine.
Of course. So this was spontaneous generation of filk and yet another place.
I didn't know the name, but I knew song parodies. And I wrote some. I called that section Music of the Spheres, as I recall. Yep. And I also had Doomed Lensman, which was the start of a rather long book. It's up on the web now, in which the lensmen were destroyed by, well, first it looked like Arlene Vedder was going to do it, but it turned out to be Mark Duquesne. Yeah. If you go and search for it, you'll find it. It's a terrifying but interesting novella.
Yeah.
Perhaps
ever
fairly
talked
long.
to Doc Smith about that?
Never had the guts. But it did get 1 or 2 good reviews by people who appreciated the scope of the thing. Clovia was blown apart by several suns, all clashing together in a blinding flash and a deafening report. You know.
Once you had started going to LASFS meetings, did you stick with LASFS? Had you gotten over your little problem there?
No, we attended LASFS and continued having Third Foundation meetings, both.
In fact, that's sort of how we became friends, because I started coming to Third Foundation meetings.
Right, the Third Foundation continued through issue 105.
Right.
And continued having songs in it.
Right.
One of the people that I met who helped me mimeograph Third Foundation was Ted Johnstone, who stayed at LASFS until 1972, when his wife got a job near Philadelphia, and he had to move to be with her because she was the family income. He wrote Man from Uncle books, among other things.
Right.
And Barry and I recently put up a key to the references in his Man from Uncle books on the web, because there's a tremendous amount of references. And
Science fiction references?
everything references. References to
British detective fiction.
references to T.E. Lawrence, references to Fu Manchu, references to almost anything you can think, references to his old friends. When Ted left, real name Dave McDaniel, when Dave left Los Angeles, this was all the folk songs that we knew of, about 120 pages.
So is that
includes,
120 songs or 200 songs?
Somewhere around there. Some of the songs are short, some of the songs go on for a couple of pages. At that point, Boston had 16 pages of songs that they knew of that I got from Tamara Lindsay. And I said, we have more than this in LA. And I traded for a copy of her 16 pages. I sent her about 100 pages more of the songs I had, which were the 4 Bruce Pelz filk song manuals,
This is
plus
something we should get into.
the Steph and Fantasy songbook, which had been published by Hal Shapiro
Yeah.
Yes.
for the 1960 Worldcon, which he had cleverly said was published in 2060, which is going to confuse bibliographers.
We need a
years
second edition of
to come.
that in about 40 years. You know
Right.
that.
Right. So about a year after I joined Fandom, that would have been November of '64. Sometime in '65, Bruce Pelz decided that there should be filk songs available.
She's read my
Okay.
history.
No, but these
Yeah.
Go
people,
on.
whoever's
So-
listening may not.
Okay.
Yes. So he published this thin little thing about 40 pages long
Was Bruce filking with you at the time?
called the Filk Song Manual.
Bruce ran his own way. Bruce was always a very dominant figure, as was Bijo, who, when I came in, was up in the Bay Area.
Right.
Were you around when Bijo was still living in LA, or had she already gone north?
No, she was in LA when I joined. She and John went away for a couple of years and then came back.
And there was a power struggle.
It was a bit of it's not that much of a power struggle, but yeah.
I
Between-
remember it at the time as they came back and said, "We're back, you can all relax.
Right, we'll take over now?
We'll take back the reins of power, which we temporarily abandoned." And everyone said, "We're fine with Bruce."
Yep.
And there was this,
Did that continue? Or did that smooth
No,
out?
it was "We're fine with Bruce, Bicho, nice to see you again," was what I perceived as a newcomer.
Pretty much, yeah. But basically, Bruce had started. Bruce started a new zine. He used.
Speleogram?
No,
What
God, I
was
can't
he
remember what it
using?
was called anymore.
He did Ratatosk.
Ratatosk, right?
Yes.
Ratatosk, the squirrel, right? And he started out using pre-printed paper that Ron Elick had used for Star Sprinkle.
Except Ron had died in that traffic accident.
This was before Ron died.
Okay.
Ron had stopped doing Star Sprinkle and basically given the paper to Bruce, who thriftily used it. So
course.
it was overprinted, Star Sprinkle presents
Speleogram.
Ratatosk, and then eventually he ran out of that and it was just Ratatosk.
Right.
So we had our own local news zine there
Which
that
was
kept us
nice.
abreast of stuff. And then he printed the new Folk Song Manual, 40 pages of songs. And then about a year after that, he printed Volume 2, which he titled Slightly Local. It was all songs by and about LASFS. And then he did 2 more over the next several years.
In '67, there were only 3 of them out.
Right.
He and Bruce and Ted were doing a 2-hour filk sing in the afternoon at the Worldcon, and they would stop every half hour or so, very briefly for 5 minutes, while Bruce said, "By the way, you could be singing along if you bought copies of the filk song manual."
Oh, by the way, that was what that was what filking was like in Los Angeles in the early '60s. Was you'd have one person leading and everybody else singing along, very much like what we now call a hymnal filk.
Yeah, very much like New England.
And Bruce and Ted in this case were leading.
Ted with the guitar.
Ted with the guitar. And Bruce with a very powerful voice.
Yes.
Well, they both had relatively good voice.
Ted was a better singer, but Bruce had more volume.
It's true.
What was the predominant kind of song then? Was it literary based or funny, or was it a mix like it is today?
A mix like it is today.
Let's talk about the kind of songs. The first thing you have to understand is that technology, okay, this is my theory. Technology determines the kind of songs you get. And that means that when your recording device weighs 30 to 50 pounds.
Remember Reel to Reel?
Oh, yeah. I'm old. I remember.
You do not generally have the ability to pick up a song to an original tune, especially when, well, there were some of us who could read sheet music. There still are, but not as many, because it's no longer the fashion of parents to have their little children at age 7 to 12 given piano lessons.
That's true.
And so the first Pelz hymnal started out with the Jesse James songs.
Right.
Because we all knew these folk songs, they are campfire songs, and that means that all the notes that were hard to sing were eliminated centuries ago because they had to be all things that you could sing easily around the campfire. They're all easy tunes.
Right. They don't have a lot of range, and they don't do anything strange in the way of succession. They just follow, all the old traditional harmonic rules that make a melody predictable. You hear the first line of the melody, you usually know where it's going from there.
Right.
Okay. So you got things like Yggdrasil silver 9-volt splash is a noble piece of ash that shelters Norns and gods and all that crew. There's a dragon gnaws the base of an eagle's resting place, and 4 hearts of gold and squirrel complete the zoo. That's the childish Edda to go with the elder Edda and the younger Edda.
And it was written by Poul Anderson, who came by his knowledge of Norse history very legitimately.
Very organic.
And with Ron Elick, and Karen Anderson told us that they wrote it when they were driving down from Orinda or San Francisco or somewhere up north down to Los Angeles for some convention, maybe a Worldcon. Well, Karen was like, 5'8", 5'10"? She and Astrid, as a child, were crammed into the teeny tiny back seat of a Morris Minor, and she kept saying, "Poul, can I drive? I'd love to drive." "No, dear, we're writing a song." All the way down. And it was a very good song. And then to the same tune, the York's marching song. "Oh, Soren had some rings, they were very useful things."
Excuse me.
Sorry.
Soren had some rings, they were very useful things, and he only wanted one to keep. But Isildur took the one just to have a little fun. Soren's finger was inside it, what a creep.
Soren had no friends to help him at the end, not even an orc or a sleigh. Orc.
It was dirty Frodo Baggins that freed his little wagon and fixed his little wagon and laid poor Sauron in his grave. Then there's a short one about Jesus Christ.
Let's
not sing quite so many, because I want to hear more about the people.
And then the Silverlock songs.
Yeah, those are great.
Okay. The next thing you have to understand was that the way they got permission to publish these things, because these were songs his author was still alive, was that Bruce Pelz and Ted Johnstone, alias, whose real name was David McDaniel, but he picked a name out of a phone book to enter fandom and stuck with it. And Owen Hannafin
Yeah.
went on a trip which involved staying overnight at Heinlein's Fallout Shelter and then going on in Colorado, which was the start of Man in the High Castle's idea, going on to Dave's grandfather's place, farm, where they spent the night in a barn. While you're at it, would you take the old crate of dynamite out of the barn and throw it out? And it turned out the dynamite was sweating.
Oh,
So
dear.
the boys very carefully took the crate of dynamite and all the straw it was resting on and threw it into the river. We're very relieved that nothing exploded.
This is Bruce and Ted.
And Owen Hannafin, who's gone
Oh.
now, San Francisco, and eventually got to where the author of Silverlock was living
John Myers.
and sang these songs to him and got his permission to publish them along with the sheet music that had been set. And the chords here were set on Bruce's chord organ, which means they were not devised with guitars in mind.
I always wondered about that.
Yeah.
And when I republished these songs books, we redid the chords
Right.
with
For human
on
people?
a chord organ, it doesn't matter what key you play in.
Push the button.
And if you need to throw in a B flat seventh, you just push the button.
and when we got to
If you're a guitarist, it's like, what?
and when he got to the continuation of this last verse, which had been put in by Ruth,
Originally, the verse ends, once a centaur loved a Lapithian dame, so he thought he'd work to try to snatch the same, but that cutie didn't thank him for his pass, for she said she knew he was a horse's. And at that point in the book, a fight breaks out, and you never hear the rest of the song.
I mean, it's perfectly obvious what the rhyme word was going to be, but Mr. Myers was too much a creature of his time to put in a dirty word like ass. So it stopped. So Ruth Berman of Minneapolis finished it. And when Ted sang him the rest of this, he was somewhat surprised that someone had had the temerity to, well, he was. He was older, like 40 years older than these young guys. He was somewhat surprised that someone had had the temerity to finish his song. But he said if you had to finish the song, it was not bad, and he would give them permission to publish it with the finished version, which was something that they were obviously asking permission for, because you don't do that without permission, right?
Right. Not if you're a nice person. No.
Well,
Non-litigious.
in those days, people didn't sue as much, but it was still important to ask, because getting sued by a professional author is awkward. It was not done nearly as much in the 60s as it is being done nowadays, but it's still awkward.
So you've talked a little bit about Bruce and you've talked about Ted. Who are the other movers and shakers at that time?
Okay, let me go back, because one of the big things we have to talk about, it's going to be on a panel on Saturday, is how the word filk started, which was with a typo. It started with Lee Jacobs of LASFS's typo.
Was he a filker?
No,
He liked
he
folk
was a
song.
typoist. He made a typo.
No, I understand that, but he was writing about folk song, right?
No, Lee Jacobs was a member of SAPS. You know SAPS? Okay.
Spectator Amateur Press Society. Yes.
Right. Comes out, I don't remember if it's
I
still
think
around.
it's dead.
Once a quarter, and you had to produce 4 pages every quarter to stay in. And Lee had written this essay, visual quotes here, about the quote, the influence of science fiction on modern American folk song. Only he mistyped it as filk song.
And what
But
it was,
I and O are adjacent on the keyboard.
Right.
and what
And he sent it in to SAPS. Ray Ballard was the official editor of SAPS at the time.
WRAI. And what it was about was what was called at the time dirty songs.
Now we call them bawdy.
We are not
the Good Ship Venus and things like that.
What we are talking about is the era in which sending jargon or what's it? Mrs. Chatterley.
No, Lady Chatterley's lover
was punishable by arrest and jail. Okay, and Ray Ballard looked at this essay, in which was quoting stuff like Eskimo Nell or worse, and said, "I'm not going to mail this stuff out," and told Lee J, "I'm not sending this filthy essay of yours out to our members." No.
But he did tell a lot of his friends. He told everybody about it, including Karen Anderson.
Karen was at this point
Karen Cruzy, I think.
Karen Cruzy, was not yet married. She was 19 or 20 years old. She was going to school in D.C. because her father had died. Karen told me that if her father, who was an engineer and subscribed to Astounding Science Fiction and had lots of SF books, and forbade his daughter to read them because it was not suitable for a young girl to read science fiction. And she said, if my father hadn't died, I would never have been allowed to go to college.
Wow.
Because we're talking about the late 40s, early 50s. Yeah. This is horrifying to me. It was horrifying to Karen.
Right.
But
so Karen decided this word filk was wonderful. Filk song ought to have a meaning, and so she assigned it one for a phenomenon that already existed. I mean, when we trace it back, we find people singing filk songs, what we now call filk songs, in the 1940 Worldcon.
Sure, the Jack Spearden the song sheet.
She was the one who gave it the name filk song,
and she was being courted, and a year or two later married Poul Anderson, and she said, "Poul, write me a folk song." And so she published in her SAP scene a song that she and Poul, but mostly Poul, I think, had written, and wrote on it a folk song.
Which one was it? Do you remember?
It's the one you will not have heard of. We're going to be handing out copies of it at the panel on Saturday.
The memorial panel, or
that's on Sunday.
The History of Filk panel.
The History of Filk panel.
I'll be there. I'm moderating. I better be there.
Yeah.
You better be there. Right.
And so this is just, to me, astonishing. I loved Karen. We were close. I met her in '67, and Poul. One of the fascinating things about filk is that there's total equality in it. Poul wrote a story. It was in one of his Tales of the Flying Sorcerers anthology, in which there's some people who are flying around the solar system and they're singing songs to the tune of When Johnny Comes Marching Home, but the chorus is Hurrah for the Transporteers. Can you remember one of Poul's verses?
Oh, Jonah was a transporteer, he was. Oh, Jonah was a transporteer, he was. A storm at sea was getting mean, so he invented the submarine. Bravo, bravo, hurrah for the transporteers.
Well, I read the story and I thought, this is a nice song, but it could use more verses. It only had 5 or 6. And I showed it to my friends, and we wrote some more. And came a WesterCon, and Ted had a concert, and there was Poul in the audience, and Ted started singing, and Poul was smiling happily as his verses started the song, and then there were a few more that he hadn't written, and he looked, well, he was still smiling, but he was looking a little surprised, not understandably. How about the Amalfi one?
Amalfi was a transporteer, he was. Amalfi was a transporteer, he was.
He dished his enemy one and all, which proves you can't fight City Hall.
Bravo, bravo, hurrah for the transporteers.
A reference to Blish's Cities in Flight series.
Yes.
And the very last verse, which we also wrote, was, okay, do you remember that one?
Nick Van Ryn was a transporteer, he was. When Nick Van Ryn was a transporteer, he was. He schemed and fought for the lion's share of everything the traffic would bear. Bravo, bravo, hurrah for the transporteers. Because, of course, you'll remember the motto of Solar Spice and Liquors.
I don't remember the motto, but I remember the character well.
All the traffic will bear.
There you
Right,
go.
and we put that at the end. This must always be the last verse.
There you go.
And at the end, as Dave was leaving, Poul came up and said, very humbly, could I have a copy of that song? And we said, yes, Poul, of course. And he said, thank you very much. If you come up to my room, I'll have Bubbles Broxson sing you Mary O'Meara to the original Swedish tune that I used when I wrote it. And we said, we'd like to hear that, Poul. Thank you.
He was a sweetheart.
And there has always been some of the things that are in here are songs by Isaac Asimov and DeCamp and back in
Randall Garrett.
Right.
Okay, Garrett wrote a bunch of songs summarizing the plots of various science fiction books. And now we get to go back to where some of this started. Once upon a time in the 1920s or thereabouts, there was a guy called Newman, either Levy or Levy. I never met him. I don't know how you pronounce his last name. Levy, who wrote two books. One is called Opera Guide, Guyd, meaning made fun of. And the other is called Drama Guide. And the only one of his songs I've ever heard, poems, whatever, I've ever heard sung, and you may have heard it, is Thais. Because Newman Levy is the guy who wrote One Time
I'm in Alexandria, in wicked Alexandria, where nights were wild with revelry and life was but a game. There lived so the reporters and adventurous and courtesan, the pride of Alexandria, and Thais was her name.
And it goes on for 2 or 3 pages to summarize the plot of the opera Thais.
Right. Now, not only is this tragic opera summarized funny, but he uses
treble rhymes.
He does treble rhymes. He does he rhymes between the half point of a verse and of a line and the end point of the line. And sometimes, in order to get the rhyme right, he'll split a word across the end of a line.
So some of the syllables are at the end of the line and some of the syllables are at the start of the next line. And Randall Garrett was writing stuff like that, summarizing various science fiction books.
Did he do Slan?
So he did Slan. He did the Demolished Man.
Yeah, he did.
Using demolishisms, which is just horrible. When I printed the Demolished Man, I had footnotes trying to explain each of these things so that people would understand what these bizarre cryptographic
He's an ES %, cent sign by the right. He's an S % by the police. Right.
To peep at all the people. Oh God, yes.
Let's move on from that.
Okay.
So was it the music that kept you involved?
It was the music and
the people.
And
no, we just have a lot of tastes in common. When
it
role-playing
helps
games showed up, we both. I started game mastering, and then began writing some role-playing games. And Barry was playing in the games I ran. We have a lot of tastes.
But it was,
in common.
it was the Third Foundation. It was the song. Certainly, the fact, like. At midnight at the end of that LASFS meeting, which was meeting at that time in a big old house that several of us, a slant shack, that several of us lived in, and we and there I am singing
What a
Beautiful Martian, and to Lee, and down comes Owen Hannafin tromping down the stairs. Some of us has to work in the morning.
Well, you had a job too.
I had to work in the morning too, but I was like 20, and it's like, okay,
Invincible.
I'll get 3 hours sleep, I'm good.
Invincible.
Well, also, of course, you were a programmer and no one cared what time you showed up.
That's true.
They just cared if you got your programs written.
Yep.
But we got married 2 years after we met, which by that time we knew who we were and what we were getting into, I think.
Yeah.
Reinforced each other over the years, huh?
Yeah.
I think so. We've had good times, and we've come through some troubles. He had a stupid heart attack at one point.
So I think we could go on for hours,
We
but I
could.
think we should probably
Yeah.
get ready to wrap up. So any last comments about those early days?
They were fun.
Yes.
Is it still fun?
It is
yeah.
still fun. We still keep coming to conventions and going to filks and things like that.
Well, I started filking in the 70s, and you were well known then. You were Fanish filking gods over here,
Oh, dear God.
and you still are. So, anyways, thanks so much for talking about it, and I think we'll have to do this again sometime
It would be
and
fun.
pick up where we left off.
Yeah, we should probably get at some point into the publishing, because we didn't even touch on the concept of the fact that I publish filk stuff.
Can you name a few titles before we cut off?
Oh, well, I publish my own songs under the title of Filker Up, and I publish Xenofilkia, which tries to carry a whole lot of other people's songs, including stuff I assume that I just want to be able to ensure that everybody should be able to pick it up and be able to sing it at second try. And therefore, there's got to be some way they can find the melody. And if someone says, I can sing it perfectly, I don't care if other people won't be able to know the melody. I say, I'm sorry, that isn't going to work. Everybody has to be able to figure out the tune.
Xenofilkia was the first filk fanzine, right?
I don't think so.
No?
But it's the one that's still around. We just hit number 180 with this convention.
Wow, that's fabulous.
So that's 30 years.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Sure, it's been nice.